On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went.
Preach, preach, preach.
Philip went down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the Christ there.
Jesus is Lord.
When the crowds heard Philip and saw the miraculous signs he did, they all paid close attention. With shrieks, evil spirits came out of many, and many paralytics and cripples were healed.
Yay!
So there was great joy in the city.
Hooray!
Good morning. Kendra and Graham have already done a great job of introducing our topic for today, which is, as they've said, the scattered church. And whenever you come to read Acts chapter 8 in the future, you won't be able to get that image of Philip preaching to a range of Disney princesses out of your mind. I don't have a shirt to compete with Graham's, but I do have coffee. On the alternate Sundays throughout the summer holidays, we're going to be doing a mini-series called Lessons from Lockdown. We didn't plan it, but that's just the way it has turned out. And we're going to be hearing from Sharon and from Sue McKenna on the things that God has been teaching them during this time. But today, I'm going to kick us off thinking about the scattered church with two aims in mind. The last time we were all together in our building was on Sunday the 15th of March, and as the lockdown measures continue to ease, many of you will be wondering when we're going to be able to meet together again. And then there is the question that no one knows the answer to. When are we going to be able to hold a service that resembles what most of us would consider normal? Are we going to have to hold our carol service on Zoom? And so with these questions in mind, my first aim is to encourage us that even though the church building remains closed, and it may remain closed for some time yet, we should not see this as a barrier to church growth. And then as we look ahead to the future, my second aim is a challenge to all of us, including me, about the ways that we think about church. Are there new ways of thinking and new ways of doing that we need to embrace as we move forward? Are there things that we used to do that we need to stop doing? Are there new things that we've been doing during lockdown that we need to make sure that we continue? But first, some coffee. The context for our reading from Acts chapter 8 was that the church had been growing rapidly. At the beginning of Acts chapter 2, there were about 120 followers of Jesus. By the end of that chapter, there were over 3,000. By chapter 4, the number has jumped again to well over 5,000. And in chapter 6, we read that the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly. And of course, all of this was happening without any church buildings. And for those of us who have needed it, this time has been a reminder that when we talk about the church, we're not talking about a building. When the New Testament talks about the church, it never refers to a building. There were no church buildings in Acts. The church was the people, and typically in Acts, they would gather in small congregations in people's houses. And so when you read about the church in Acts, Luke is referring to a specific group of Jesus followers who met together. It's got nothing to do with a building. And so we need to be encouraged that during this time God can and God has been growing the church. Just because our building remains closed doesn't mean that the church is closed. The church is alive and well because the church is the people. And then as we move forward, many of us probably need to work really hard to separate out in our minds the idea of the church from the building. By Acts chapter 8, the number of disciples was increasing rapidly within Jerusalem. Back at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, we heard a lot about the R value. In March, R was about 3, and this meant that a person infected with the coronavirus went on to infect 3 other people, who each went on in turn to infect 3 more people. And so the virus spread very quickly. And because of the lockdown measures, that figure, according to the government website, is now somewhere between 0.7 and 0.9. Clearly, in the book of Acts, the good news of Jesus was very infectious, and that the D value was very high, where D is the number of disciples that one disciple goes on to make. And so it seems as though once you had one disciple in a place, there was a very good chance that after a little while you would have more. And this was a serious flaw in Saul's plan to wipe out the church. And so instead of crushing the movement, the disciples spread out. They were scattered, and everywhere they went, they talked to people about Jesus. And so more people became disciples. As we look to the future, we need to take an honest and a serious look at ourselves and ask, how effective have we been at making disciples? What's our D value? And I think that we'd have to conclude that our D value is a lot closer to 0.7 than it is to 3. And I wonder whether this has got something to do with the way that we think about church. The way that we think about church leads to behaviour that keeps D below 1. So are we a socially distanced church? Social distancing has been a key factor in halting the spread of the coronavirus. If you test positive, you isolate yourself, and then you don't pass on the virus to anyone else. Jesus intended his disciples to go and make disciples, and yet so often the church has socially distanced itself from the wider community. We've confused being the church with going to a building. And as a result, we often quarantine the good news from the very people who need to hear it. We live in a culture where we increasingly see ourselves as consumers, and so church equates to that place where I go to sit and to watch while certain things are done and said by people more qualified and experienced than me. We also live in a culture where we are encouraged to compartmentalise our lives, and so we go to work. We go home, we go to the gym or to the wine club, and we go to church. And we keep all of these different parts of our lives separate from each other. We may even adopt different ways of speaking, or different ways of thinking, or different ways of behaving, depending on which box we're in. And all of this adds up to a situation where the only way that people are going to hear about Jesus is if they walk through the doors of our building. Are we a masked church? We all know that wearing a mask greatly reduces the chance of spreading coronavirus. The reason that Saul's plan in Acts chapter 8 failed so spectacularly was because wherever these Christians were scattered, they started talking about Jesus. Jesus' talk wasn't just something that happened in the church box, in that building where we go on a Sunday morning. But they talked about Jesus wherever they went. They didn't compartmentalise their lives, and their faith was integral in everything that they did. It never occurred to them that they should only talk about their faith when they were in the church box. People today are desperate for good news about a coronavirus vaccine, and every time there is the slightest possible bit of progress, it makes the news. And these disciples had good news. They had the good news that could make the difference between life and death, and so they wanted to share it with everyone that they met. And yet for many of us, our faith, our relationship with Jesus is only something that we ever talk about when we're in the church box. It's as if we're wearing a mask, and people will only ever hear the good news about Jesus if they walk through the door of our building. Are we a sanitized church? We all know the importance of washing our hands properly so that we don't pick up the virus from touching contaminated surfaces. And these disciples in Acts, they were out there living in a messy world. They were getting their hands dirty. We have the story of Philip. Now surely the temptation in a climate where Christians are being thrown into prison would be to keep your head down, to fly under the radar. But Philip wasn't afraid of getting his hands dirty, getting involved with those that many others would have left well alone. Those with evil spirits, the paralysed, the lame, those who are on the very edge of society. And that's where Jesus wants his disciples to be, out there, alongside the poor and the marginalised, getting our hands dirty. But the temptation is always there to see church as what we do on a Sunday morning and not to want to put ourselves in messy situations where we might end up getting our hands dirty. And so the most needy will only hear the good news of Jesus if they walk through the doors of our building. Research carried out a few weeks into lockdown showed that people were keen to explore questions of faith. They were keen to view online services and to pray. And whilst part of their interest was undoubtedly a response to the pandemic, their feeling of hopelessness, of being out of control, losing things that they'd put their trust in, awareness of our own mortality, some of that response was also due to a church that was no longer socially distanced, masked or sanitised. They didn't need to go to a building on a Sunday morning to hear about Jesus. They knew people who were offering to pray for them and who were now talking about their faith. There were people who were putting themselves out to make sure that the most vulnerable in our communities were having their needs met, whether that was getting the shopping or making a telephone call. So let's be encouraged that just because our building is closed, the church is very much alive. And as we look forward, let's make sure that we put things in place, both individually and as a church, to make sure that once lockdown is over, we're not still locked into ways of thinking and being that means that we are a socially distanced, masked and sanitised church.